Kommandant van Heerden nevertheless spent a restless first night in his room at Wazen Spa. For one thing, the strong smell of sulphur irritated his olfactory nerve, and for another, one of the many taps in his room insisted on dripping irregularly. In Piemburg, Operation Whitewash was about to move into a new phase. Sergeant Breitenbach's enthusiasm for the project was, as usual, less marked. 200 at a time in the drill hall? He asked, incredulously. 200 constables strapped to chairs and wired up in the drill hall? Those generators aren't big enough to shock 200 men. We'll use the mains, said Verkramp. With a transformer. Of course, said the sergeant, with an insane laugh. A transformer off the mains. And what happens if something goes wrong? Nothing is going to go wrong, said Verkramp. But Sergeant Breitenbach wasn't listening. He was visualizing a drill hall filled with the corpses of 200 constables, electrocuted while being shown slides of naked black women. Quite apart from the public outcry, he would almost certainly be lynched by the widows. Sergeant Breitenbach, what we are doing is for the ultimate good of the white race in South Africa, Verkramp said solemnly. Are you prepared to sacrifice the future of your country simply because you are afraid to take a risk? Yes, said Sergeant Breitenbach, who couldn't see how the electrocution of 200 policemen could possibly benefit South Africa. Sergeant Breitenbach left Verkramp to sort the thing out with the electricity board. The tempo of events since Verkramp had taken over was so rapid the sergeant was beginning to feel totally confused. Much the same could be said of the state of mind of Verkramp's secret agents. Lack of sleep, the need to move their lodgings, the incessant following and being followed that was so much a part of their duties had left them utterly exhausted and with what little hold on reality they had ever possessed badly impaired. The one sure thing they all knew was that they had been ordered to get the real saboteurs to blow something up. In Florian's cafe, they sat round a table and worked to this end. 745396 suggested the petrol storage tanks in the railway yard as a suitable target. 628461 was in favor of the gasworks. 885974, not to be outdone, recommended the sewage disposal plant on the grounds that the ensuing epidemic would benefit the cause of world communism, and all the others had their own favorite targets. By the time they had argued the pros and cons of each suggestion, no one was clear what target had finally been selected, and the air of mutual suspicion had been exacerbated by 885974, who had accused 745396 of being a police spy, in the belief that this would add credulity to his own claim to be a genuine saboteur. Accusations and counter-accusations were exchanged, and when the group finally left to go their none too separate ways, each agent was determined to prove himself to the others by a demonstration of zeal for sabotage. That night, Piemburg experienced a second wave of bombings. "Isn't it time you did something about these saboteurs? Things are getting out of hand," said Sergeant Breitenbach. Verkramp stirred uneasily in his chair. He had the feeling that his authority was being impugned. "I can see you got out of bed on the wrong side this morning," he said. "I didn't get out at all," said the sergeant. "I was blown out by the sewage disposal works." Lieutenant Verkramp stood up and strode across to the window and stared out. "I'm about to strike a blow at the root of all this evil," he said, dramatically. "Where do you think we should start looking?" the sergeant asked. "In the heart of man, in his soul, in the innermost regions of his nature," said Verkramp. "For saboteurs?" asked Sergeant Breitenbach. "For evil," said Verkramp. He handed the sergeant a long list of names. "I want these men to report to the drill hall immediately. Everything is ready. The chairs have been wired and the projector and the screen have been installed. Here is a list of the sergeants who will administer the treatment." Sergeant Breitenbach stared maniacally at his commanding officer. "You've gone mad," he said finally. "You must have gone out of your mind. We've got the biggest wave of bombings this country has seen, with petrol tanks and gasometers going up and radio masts coming down, and all you can think about is stopping people going to bed with goons. The sooner we have a truly Christian and incorruptible police force, the sooner we will be able to eradicate the evil of which these bombings are merely the symptom," said Verkramp. "That smoke out there is a sign from heaven of God's anger. Let us all see to it that we incur no more." End of Side 2. Side 3. 20 minutes later, Breitenbach was facing near mutiny in the drill hall as 200 constables, already alarmed at the deteriorating situation in the city, refused to allow themselves to be strapped to the chairs wired to a large transformer. Quite a few had already said that they would rather stand trial for sleeping with Kaffir girls and take their chance of getting 10 strokes with a heavy cane and do 7 years hard labour than run the risk of electrocution. When the last constable was finally seized by 4 sergeants and had sticking plaster swiftly clapped over his mouth and was strapped to the last empty chair, 200 silent constables glared frantically at their acting commandant. The lights were switched off and the projector on. On the vast screen at the end of the hall, naked as the day she was born and 40 times as large, there appeared the brilliantly coloured image of a gigantic black woman. Lieutenant Verkramp mounted the stage and stood in front of the screen, partially obscuring the woman's sexual organs, with an aura of pubic hairs sprouting round his head. With the nauseating realism, Verkramp opened his mouth, his face livid with projected labia. "This is for your own good," he said. "By the time you leave the hall, your transracial sexual tendencies will have been eradicated forever. You will have been cleansed of the lusts of the flesh. Start the treatment." Below him, 200 constables jerked in their seats with a uniformity of movement that had been noticeably lacking in any of their drill practice. At Fort Rapier Mental Hospital, Dr. von Bleimenstein was unaware of the effect her advice about aversion therapy was having on the lives of Piemburg's policemen. She still thought about Verkramp and wondered why he hadn't contacted her, but the outbreak of sabotage suggested an explanation which did something to satisfy her vanity. "He's too busy, poor lamb," she thought, and found an outlet for her sense of disappointment by trying to cope with the influx of patients suffering from acute anxiety following the bombings. A great many were suffering from bloodbath phobias and were obsessed by the belief that they were going to be chopped to pieces one morning by the black servant next door. "Why the servant next door?" Dr. Bleimenstein asked a particularly disturbed woman who wouldn't even allow a black orderly into her room at the hospital to empty the chamber pot, but preferred to do it herself, an action so extraordinarily menial for a white woman that it was a clear symptom of insanity. "Because that's what my kitchen boy told me," the woman said through her tears. "I said to him, 'Joseph, you wouldn't kill your missus, would you?' And he said, 'No, missus, the boy next door would kill you, and I'd kill his missus for him.' You see, they've got it all worked out. We're going to be massacred in our beds when they bring the tea at 7 o'clock in the morning." "You don't think it might be wise to give up morning tea?" the doctor asked, but the woman wouldn't hear of it. "I don't think I could get through the day without my morning cup of tea," she said. Dr. von Bleimenstein wrote her usual prescription in such cases and sent her to see the gunnery instructor. "Occupational therapy," she explained to the woman, who was presently happily engaged in firing a .38 revolver into targets painted to look like black servants holding tea trays in one hand and pangas in the other. Dr. von Bleimenstein's next patient suffered from black cock fever, which was even more frequent than bloodbath phobia. "I've got such big ones," she mumbled to the doctor when asked what the trouble was. "Big what?" Dr. von Bleimenstein asked, though she could recognize the symptoms immediately. "You know, long forked swords." "Who have?" "Gaffers have. They're 18 inches long and 3 inches thick, and they've got foreskins like umbrellas, and they—" "Now, hold it a moment," Dr. von Bleimenstein said as the woman became more hysterical. "Hold it!" she screamed. "Hold it! I couldn't bear to look at it! Don't hold the beastly thing!" Dr. von Bleimenstein leant across the desk. "That's not what I meant," she said. "You're taking this thing too far." "Far?" shrieked the woman. "I'd say it's far. It's far farther than I can take it. It's instant hysterectomy. They hang weights on the end to make them longer," she said, finally. "I think we can cure your phobia," Dr. von Bleimenstein said, making some notes. "Now, the course of treatment I'm prescribing is a little unusual at first sight, but you'll soon get the hang of it. First of all, what we do is this. We get you used to the idea of holding quite a small penis, a small white one, and then—" "You must be mad," shouted the woman. "I wouldn't dream of such a thing. I'm a respectable married woman, and if you think I'm going to—" She began to weep hysterically. Dr. von Bleimenstein leant across the desk reassuringly. "All right," she said. "We'll start with pencils. Have you any rooted objection to holding a pencil?" "Of course not," said the woman. "Why the hell should I mind holding a pencil?" "How about a banana? You want me to hold it or eat it?" the woman inquired. "Just hold it." That's no problem. A banana and 2 plums? The woman looked at her critically. I'll hold a fruit salad if you think it'll do me any good, though what the hell you think you're getting at is beyond me. In the end, Dr. von Bleimenstein began treatment by accustoming the patient to hold a vegetable marrow until it ceased to provoke any symptoms of anxiety. Extraordinary number of drunks there are about these days, Major Bloxham remarked at breakfast. Met a fellow in a bar last night, a Mr. Mulpurgo, lectures in English at the university, can't have been more than 30, blind drunk and kept shouting about a purpose in liquidity of all things. Had to take him back to the hotel. Some sort of spa. Spa? Asked Mrs. Heathcote Kilcoon when the Colonel had left. Did you say spa, boy? A run-down sort of place. Takes guests, said the Major. Then that must be where the Commandant is staying, Mrs. Heathcote Kilcoon said. She finished her breakfast and ordered the rolls, and presently, leaving the Colonel and Major Bloxham discussing the seating at the Dawnford Yates Club dinner that evening, she drove over to Wazen. There's something so earthy about him, she murmured, as she parked outside the Wazen Spa and went inside. There was something fairly earthy about the Commandant's room when she finally found it, knocked on the door. The Commandant opened it in his underwear. He'd been changing to go fishing and shut it again hurriedly. By the time he opened it again properly apparelled, Mrs. Heathcote Kilcoon, who had spent the interval studying the enamel plaque on the door, had drawn her own conclusions as to the origin of the smell. They went and stood on the terrace where the air was fresher. I'm so sorry you've been stranded here like this, she said. It's all our fault. We looked for you at the hotel in town, but I had no idea that this place existed. She leaned voguishly against the balustrade and contemplated the building with its stippled portico and faded legend. The Commandant explained that he had tried to phone, but he couldn't find the number. Of course you couldn't, my dear, said Mrs. Heathcote Kilcoon, taking his arm and leading him down into the garden. We don't have one. Henry's so secretive, you know. He plays the stock market, and he can't bear the thought of anyone listening in and making a killing in Kaffirs, because he's heard Henry telling his broker to buy Free State Gadulls. That's understandable, said the Commandant, completely at sea. Mrs. Heathcote Kilcoon said, as the Commandant helped her into the rolls, Dinner's at 8, cocktails at 7. I'll look forward to seeing you. Au revoir. And with a wave of her mauve glove, she was gone. Back in his room at the Spa, Kommandant van Heerden studied his book Etiquette for Everyman and tried to remember which fork to use for fish. At 6 he had a makeshift bath and sprayed himself all over with deodorant to neutralize the smell of sulphur. Then he put on the Harris tweed suit he had had made for him at Scurfield and Todd, the English tailors in Piemburg, and which the coloured maid had pressed meticulously for him, and at 7 drove up to White Ladies. The gravel forecourt was crowded with cars. The Commandant parked and went up the steps to the front door, which was opened by the Zulu butler. Mrs. Heathcote Kilcoon came down the hall to receive him. "Oh, my God," she said by way of welcome, appalled at the Commandant's suit. Everyone else was wearing dinner jackets, and then, with a greater show of savoir-faire, "Well, never mind, it can't be helped," ushered the Commandant into a room filled with smoke and talk and people. "What's your poison, old man?" Major Bloxham asked. The Commandant said he'd appreciate a beer. The Major looked askance. "Can't have that, my dear fellow," he said. "Cocktails, you know. The good old 20s and all that. Have an Paul special." Before the Commandant could ask what an Paul special was, the Major was busy with a shaker. "Very tasty," said the Commandant, sipping the drink, which consisted of apple brandy, Dubonnet, and to make it special, had an extra slug of vodka. "How do you like it?" said the Major. "Knock it back, and you can have a sledgehammer." The Commandant moved slowly round the room, catching a sentence here and there about roses and the July handicap and somebody's divorce. At the makeshift bar, Major Bloxham gave him a 3rd degree. "Appropriate, old boy, what?" he said. But before the Commandant could drink, a gong had reverberated, and not wishing to waste the cocktail, the Commandant poured it into a goldfish bowl before going in to dinner. "You ought to sit between La Marquise and me," Mrs. Heathcote Kilcoon said, as they stood awkwardly around the long table in the dining room. "That way you'll be safe." And the Commandant presently found himself next to what he took to be a distinctly queer man in a dinner jacket who kept calling everyone darling. He shifted his chair a little closer to Mrs. Heathcote Kilcoon, uncomfortably aware that the man was eyeing him speculatively. In a moment of silence, the man on his right asked him what he did. "Do?" said the Commandant suspiciously. The word had too many meanings for an easy answer. The Marquise discerned his embarrassment. "For a living, darling, do for a living." "Not me, for God's sake, that I do assure you." Round the table everyone laughed, and the Commandant added to it by saying that he was a policeman. He was about to say that he'd seen some fucking poofters in his time, but when Mrs. Heathcote Kilcoon whispered, "She's a woman," in his ear. By the time the coffee had been served and the port was circulating, the Commandant had quite recovered his self-confidence. He had scored it twice, quite accidentally, off La Marquise, once by asking if her husband was present, and the second time by leaning across her to reach for the salt and jostling what there was of her well-disguised bosom. On his left, flushed with wine and the Commandant's pervasive manliness, Mrs. Heathcote Kilcoon pressed her leg discreetly against his, smiling brightly and fingering her pearls. At the end of the table, Colonel Heathcote Kilcoon, who felt that he needed to assert his authority somewhere, ordered the waiters to bring liqueurs. It was not a wise move. Major Bloxham, evidently still piqued by the failure of his Paul special and sledgehammer to render the Commandant suitable for debagging, offered him some Chartreuse. As his port glass filled with the stuff, the Commandant looked at it interestedly. "I've never seen a green wine before," he said, finally. "Made from green grapes, I'll buy," said the Major, and was delighted at the laugh he got. "Got to drink it all in one go." Mrs. Heathcote Kilcoon was not amused. "How low can you get, boy?" she asked unpleasantly as the Commandant swallowed the glassful. "I think we should all join the Commandant," she said suddenly. "We can't let him drink by himself. Boy, fill all the port glasses." The Major looked at her questioningly. "All?" he asked. "You heard me," said Mrs. Heathcote Kilcoon, looking vindictively from the Major to her husband. "All. I think we should all drink a toast to the South African police in honor of our guest." "I'm damned if I'm going to drink a whole glass of Chartreuse for anyone," said the Colonel. "To the South African police," said Mrs. Heathcote Kilcoon with more enthusiasm, and watched carefully while the Colonel and Major Bloxham drank their glasses dry. Happily unaware of the tension around him, the Commandant sat and smiled. So this was how the English spent their evenings, he thought, and felt thoroughly at home. In the silence that followed the toast, and the realization of what a large glass of Chartreuse could do to the liver, Kommandant van Heerden rose to his feet. "I should like to say how honored I feel to be here tonight in this distinguished gathering," he said, pausing, looking at the faces that gazed glaucously back at him. "I am, as you know, an Afrikaner, or, as you British say, a Boer. But I want you to know that I admire you British very much, and I would like to propose a toast to the British Empire." It took some time for the Colonel to realize what the Commandant had just said. He opened his eyes in amazement, and was appalled to see that the Commandant had taken a bottle of Benedictine and was filling everyone's glass. "To the British Empire," he said, and drank it down. The Commandant sat down happily. The sense of disappointment that had so marred the early part of the evening had quite disappeared. So had La Marquise. With a brave attempt at one last darling, she slid, elegant to the last, beneath the table. Mrs. Heathcote Kilcoon pressed a great deal more than her leg against the Commandant. "Take me," she said, before collapsing across his lap. The Commandant looked fondly down at her blue-rinsed curls, and with unusual gallantry eased her head off his flies and stood up. "Time for bed," he said, and lifting Mrs. Heathcote Kilcoon gently from her seat, carried her to her room, closely followed by the Zulu butler, who suspected his motives. The Commandant tiptoed from the room and went to thank his host for a lovely evening. There was no sign of the Colonel in the dining room where the Dawnford Yates Club lay inertly on or under the table. As the Commandant glanced round the room, he noticed a movement under the table. Someone was evidently trying to revive La Marquise, though why this should require the removal of her trousers, the Commandant couldn't imagine. Lifting the tablecloth, he peered underneath. Her face peered back at him. The Commandant suddenly felt unwell. "I've had too much," he thought, recalling what he had heard about DTs, and dropping the cloth hurriedly, he rushed from the room. His mind was on the two eyes that had peered back at him from beneath the tablecloth. Two beady eyes and a horrid face, and the face was the face of Els. Constable Els was dead. "I'll be seeing pink elephants next," he thought in horror, as he got into his car and drove dangerously back to the spa. "I've got it," said 628461. "Got what?" asked 378550. who thought that he was being addressed and was glad of the chance to drop his role as shadow. "I was just thinking that we could get ostriches to eat jelly and let them loose, and they'd blow up all over the place." 378550 looked at 628461 with admiration. "That's brilliant," he said. "Absolutely brilliant. Of course," 628461 told him, "we'd have to put the explosive in something watertight first. Get them to swallow it. Fix a fuse, and bingo, you got the perfect sabotage weapon." 885974 didn't want to be left out of things, joined them. "French letters," he suggested when the scheme was put to him. "Put the gel ignite in French letters and tie the ends. That'll keep it watertight." An hour later, in Florian's cafe, they were discussing the plan with the rest of the saboteurs. "We'll try it out this afternoon," said 628461. While the rest of the group spent the lunch hour coding messages to Verkramp to warn him that he might expect an onslaught of detonating ostriches, 885974, who had thought of French letters in the first place, was deputed to purchase 12 dozen of the best. "What do we do when we've filled them up and set the fuse?" 745396 asked doubtfully. "Lay a trail of popcorn into the centre of town, of course," 628461 told him. The group dispersed to collect their stocks of gelignite, and that night at 9 gathered at the bird sanctuary. The sense of mutual suspicion which had so informed their earlier meetings had been quite replaced by a genuine camaraderie. Verkramp's agents were beginning to enjoy themselves. If Verkramp's agents were cheerful, the same couldn't be said of their chief. The conviction that something had gone seriously wrong with his plans to end communist subversion had gathered strength with the discovery by the armourer that large stocks of high explosive and fuses were missing from the police armoury. Coming on top of a report by the police bomb disposal squad that the detonators used in all the explosions were of a type used in the past solely by the South African police, the armourer's news added weight to Verkramp's slow intuition that he might in some curious way have bitten off more than he could chew. It was an insight he shared with 5 ostriches in the bird sanctuary. What had seemed at the outset a marvellous opportunity to fulfill his ambitions had developed into something from which there was no turning back. Certainly the ostriches viewed it in that light, as the secret agents discovered to their alarm when they released the loaded birds from their enclosure. Gregarious to the last, and evidently under the impression that there was more to come in the way of popcorn, the 5 ostriches strode after the agents as the latter headed for town. By the time the flock had reached the end of Market Street, the agents were in a state of near panic. "We'd better break up," 628461 said anxiously. Break up? We'll fucking disintegrate if those birds don't go the hell out of here," said 745396, who had never approved of the project from the start, and who seemed to have attracted the friendship of an ostrich that weighed at least 300 pounds unloaded, and which had a 15-minute fuse. The next moment the agents had taken to their heels down side roads in an effort to shake off the likely consequences of their experiment. Undaunted, the ostriches strode relentlessly and effortlessly behind them. 745396 dashed into the majestic cinema, which was showing Where Eagles Dare. "Show's over," said the commissionaire in the foyer. "That's what you think," said 745396, with his eye on the ostrich, which was peering inquisitively through the glass doors. "I just want to use the toilet." "Down the stairs to the left," the commissionaire told him, and went out to the pavement to try to move the ostrich on. 745396 went down to the toilet and locked himself in a cubicle and waited for the explosion. He was still there 5 minutes later when the commissionaire came down and knocked on the door. "Has that ostrich anything to do with you?" he asked, as 745396 tore paper off the roll to prove he was using the place for its proper purpose. "No," said 745396, without conviction. "Well, you can't leave it outside like that," the commissionaire told him. "It'll interfere with the traffic." "You can say that again," said 745396. "Say what again?" asked the commissionaire. "Nothing," shouted 745396, frantically. He had reached the end of his tether. So it appeared at the ostrich. "One last question. Do you usually—" said the commissionaire, and got no further. An extraordinary sensation of silence hit him, to be followed by a wall of flame and a gigantic bang. As the front of the majestic cinema crumbled into the street, and the lights went out, Agent 745396 slowly slumped onto the cracked seat of the toilet and leant against the wall. He was still there when the rescue workers found him next day, covered in plaster and quite dead. Throughout the night, rumors that Piemburg had been invaded by hordes of self-detonating ostriches spread like wildfire. In his office, Acting Kommandant Verkramp listened to the muffled explosions with a growing sense of despair. In a frantic attempt to allay his alarming suspicions, He had just searched the few messages from his secret agents, only to find there confirmation that his plan, if not their efforts, had misfired. Agent 378550 had said that the sabotage group consisted of 11 men. Agent 885974 had said the same. So had 628461. Verkramp added 1 to 11 and got 12. He had 12 agents in the field. The conclusion was inescapable, and so it seemed were the consequences. Desperately searching for some way out of the mess he had got himself into, Lieutenant Verkramp rose from the desk and crossed to the window. He was just in time to see a large ostrich loping purposefully down the street. With a muttered curse, Verkramp opened the window and peered after the bird. "This is the end," he snarled, and was astonished to see that at least one of his orders was obeyed. With a violent flash and a blast wave that blew out the window above him, the ostrich disintegrated, and Verkramp found himself sitting on the floor of his office with the inescapable conviction that his sanity was impaired. An hour later, having visited every bar in town, Verkramp had run 2 of his agents to earth, drinking to the success of their latest experiment in sabotage in the Criterion Hotel in Verfoot Street. "Buzz," said 628461 as Verkramp entered the bar. "Better break up." 885974 finished his drink and went out. 628461 watched him go, and was surprised to see Verkramp follow him out. "He's making an arrest," he thought, and ordered another beer. A moment later he looked up to find Verkramp glowering down at him. "Outside," said Verkramp brusquely. 628461 left his bar stool and went outside, and was surprised to find his fellow saboteur sitting unguarded in the police car. "I see you got one of them," 628461 said to Verkramp, and climbed in beside 885974. "Them? Them?" Verkramp spluttered hysterically. "Us! Not them! He's us!" "Us?" said 628461, mystified. "I'm 885974. Who are you?" "Oh, my God," said 628461. Verkramp climbed into the driving seat and stared back malevolently. "Where are the others?" he hissed. "The others?" "The other agents, you idiot!" Verkramp shouted. For the next 2 hours they searched the bars and cafes, while Verkramp fulminated on the evils of sabotaging public utilities and detonating ostriches in a built-up area. "I send you out to infiltrate the communist movement, and what do?" he shouted. "Blow up half the bloody town, that's what you do!" "You might have warned us," said 628461, reproachfully. "You could have told us there were other agents in the field." Verkramp turned purple. "Warned you?" he screamed. "I should have thought even idiots like you could tell the difference between a good Afrikaner and a communist Jew." 9 other agents had been found in various parts of the city, and the police car was getting rather crowded. "I ought to arrest you," Verkramp snarled. "I ought to let you stand trial for terrorism, but—" "You won't," said 885974, who had been giving the matter some thought, "because we'll all give evidence that you ordered us to blow up the transformer and the gasometer and the—" "All right," Verkramp said. "What do you want me to do?" "Get us past the roadblocks, get us down to Durban, and give us each 500 rand, 885974 said, "and then forget you ever saw us." At Wazen Spa, Kommandant van Heerden slept more soundly than his hallucination had led him to expect. He woke next morning with something of a hangover, but felt better after a large breakfast in the pump room. Later in the morning, the Commandant walked into Wazen, in the hope of bumping into Mrs. Heathcote Kilcoon. He had just reached the main road and was trudging along it when a horn sounded loudly behind him and caused him to jump off the road. He looked round furiously and found Major Bloxham at the wheel of the vintage Rolls. "Hop in!" shouted the Major. "Just the man I'm looking for." The Commandant climbed into the front seat and was glad to notice that the Major wasn't looking very well. "To tell the truth," said the Major when the Commandant asked if he had recovered from the evening's entertainment, "I'm not on top form this morning. Have to hand it to you, you Boers know how to hold your liquor. I wonder you made it back to the spa last night." Commandant van Heerden smiled at the compliment. "Takes more than a couple of glasses to put me under the table," he murmured modestly. "By the way," said the Commandant as they drove into Wazen, "talking of tables, is the woman in the dinner jacket all right?" "What? La Marquise, you mean?" asked the Major. "Funny you should mention her. As a matter of fact, she's not herself, or himself, difficult to tell which, this morning. Said she was feeling a bit off colour." In his seat, Commandant van Heerden went very white. "Did she say what had happened?" he asked. Major Bloxham looked at him curiously. Let me see, I remember she said something rather queer at breakfast. Oh, I know, she said, I feel absolutely buggered. That's right, seemed rather a coarse sort of thing for a woman to say. Beside him, the Commandant couldn't agree. If he had seen else under the table, he was pretty sure the lady was speaking no more than the simple truth. By the way, Daphne sent a message, said the Major. Wants to know if you'll come out with a hunt tomorrow. I'd love to, he said, but I'd have to borrow a gun. Of course, it's only a drag hunt, continued the Major, before it dawned on him that the Commandant shot foxes. A similar dreadful misunderstanding existed in the Commandant's mind. Drag hunt? He said, looking at the Major with some disgust. It's illegal, he said. I suppose you realise that? Really? How extraordinary, I'd no idea, said the Major. I mean, it's not as though anyone gets hurt or anything. The Commandant shifted uneasily on his stool. I suppose that depends which end you're on, he muttered. Bit exhausting for the poor bugger out front. I mean, running all that way, but it's only twice a week, said the Major. I mean, it's not as though it's cruel or anything. There's no actual kill. I should fucking well hope not, said the Commandant, highly incensed. We just pop a Kaffir out after breakfast with a bag of aniseed round his middle, and an hour later we all go after him. Aniseed? The Commandant asked. What's the aniseed for? Gives him a bit of a scent, you know, the Major explained. Commandant van Heerden shuddered. Scented Kaffirs being chased across country by men in their 50s dressed as women was more than he could stomach. What does Mrs. Heskett-Kilcoon think about it? He asked anxiously. What, Daphne? She loves it. I think she's keener than anyone else, said the Major. Got a wonderful seat, you know. So I've noticed, said the Commandant, who thought the comment about Mrs. Heskett-Kilcoon's anatomy quite uncalled for. And what does she wear? Major Bloxham laughed. She's one of the old school, hard as nails, wears a topper for one thing. A topper? You mean she wears a top hat? Asked the Commandant. Nothing less, old boy, and she doesn't spare the whip, I can tell you. God help the man who refuses offence. That woman will give him what for. Charming, said the Commandant, trying to imagine what it must be like to get what for from Mrs. Heskett-Kilcoon, wearing nothing less than a top hat. We can give you a good mount, said the Major. The Commandant anchored himself to his stool firmly. I dare say you can, he said sternly, but I wouldn't advise you to try. By the way, this is a matter of interest, the Commandant said. What do you wear on these, occasions? Major Bloxham smiled obscenely. Pink, old boy, pink. What else do you think a gentleman wears? In Piemburg, the question of naughty men was one that was beginning to bother Lieutenant Verkramp. The dispatch of his 11 remaining secret agents had not, after all, seen the end. Arriving at the police station, Verkramp found Sergeant Breitenbach in a state of unusual agitation. A fine mess you've got us into now, he said, when Verkramp asked him what was wrong. You mean those ostriches? Verkramp inquired. No, I don't, said the sergeant. I mean the constables you've been giving shock treatment to. They're queer. Sergeant Breitenbach went to the door. Constable Burta, he shouted. Constable Burta came into the office. There you are, said Sergeant Breitenbach grimly. That's what your bloody aversion therapy's been and done. At his desk, Lieutenant Verkramp knew now that he was going mad. He'd felt bad enough faced with exploding ostriches, but they were as nothing to the insanity he felt now confronted with the famous footballer. Constable Burta, hooker for Zululand, 6'4" and 16 stone, minced into the room wearing a yellow wig and with his mouth smudged hideously with lipstick. You lovely man, he simpered to Verkramp, sauntering like some modish elephant about the office. Keep your hands off me, you bastard, snarled the sergeant. Lieutenant Verkramp wasn't listening. The inner voices were there again, and this time there was no stopping them. With his face livid and his eyes staring, Verkramp collapsed, screaming in his chair. He was still screaming and babbling about being God when the ambulance arrived from Fort Rapier. Half an hour later, urgent messages were going out to all police stations in the area, asking them to contact Kommandant van Heerden. In the meantime, as a method of isolating the disaffected constables, Sergeant Breitenbach gave orders that they should be put through their paces on the parade ground, and sent Sergeant de Kock down there to give them drill. It was not a particularly happy choice, as Sergeant Breitenbach found when he went down to see how things were going. The 200 constables minced and pirouetted across the parade ground alarmingly. "If you can't stop them marching like that, you better get them out of sight," he told the sergeant. "It's that sort of thing that gives the South African police a bad name." When Kommandant van Heerden arrived at White Lady's, it was to find Major Bloxham, resplendent in a scarlet coat, standing on the steps. "I thought you said you always wore pink," said the Commandant, a touch of annoyance. "So I do, old boy, so I do, can't you see?" He turned and went into the house, followed by the Commandant, who wondered if he was colour-blind. In the main room, people were standing about drinking, and the Commandant was relieved to note that they were all dressed appropriately for their sex. Mrs. Heathcote Kilcoon, in a long black skirt, was looking quite lovely, if a little pale, while the Colonel's complexion matched that of his coat. "Henry's got it into his head you go round shooting foxes," she said, "and he's absolutely furious. I think you ought to know he's given you the most awful horse. Don't, for goodness sake, let him get away from you." The Commandant said he certainly wouldn't, and a few minutes later everyone trooped out to the yard where the hounds were waiting. So was Chaka. Massive and black, he stood some way apart from the other horses, and at his head there stood a figure of a man with small eyes and a non-existent forehead. It was difficult for Kommandant van Heerden, who in the excitement of going hunting had forgotten all about ex-Constable Else, to make up his mind which animal most dismayed him. With a speed and vigour that quite took the Colonel by surprise, the Commandant reached up and hauled himself into the saddle, and from those commanding heights surveyed the throng. "I'm going hunting like a real Englishman," he thought, as he dug his heels in. It was the last coherent thought he had for some time. With a demonic lurch, the great black horse shot out of the yard and into the garden. As the Commandant desperately clung to his seat, it was apparent that wherever he was going, it wasn't hunting. Kommandant van Heerden shut his eyes. There was no time for prayer. Immaculately side-saddled and with her top hat perched on her neat blue curls, Mrs. Heathcote Kilcoon watched the Commandant disappear over the azaleas with a combination of disgust at her husband and admiration for the Commandant. Whatever else he might be, the Commandant was clearly not a man to balk at fences. Else blew his horn again happily. He'd always wanted to see what would happen if he stuffed a quid of tobacco up the great black horse's arse, and now he knew. To Mrs. Heathcote Kilcoon, galloping desperately after him, the Commandant appeared in a new light. He was no longer the coarsely attractive man of reality she had formerly seen him as, but the hero of her dreams. She galloped towards the wood, and was horrified to see both horse and rider motionless on the ground. She rode up and dismounted. When Kommandant van Heerden came to, it was to find his head cradled on the lap of Mrs. Heathcote Kilcoon, who was bending over him with a look of maternal admiration on her face. "You may have concussion," she said, as her experienced hands unbuttoned his jacket. In the next few moments, Kommandant van Heerden began to think she must be right. What the great English lady was doing to him must be the result of brain damage. Above him, clad only in her boots and spurs, and with her top hat clinging elastically to the top of her tinted head, Mrs. Heathcote Kilcoon shouted encouragement to her new mount, occasionally lashing him on with her crop. They were so deeply engrossed in one another that they were oblivious to the crackling undergrowth that signalled the approach of the hunt. Out of the woods raced the pack, and the Commandant, who had been on the point of reaching his second climax, became suddenly aware that the tongue that was licking his face was of a length and texture quite unusual in a lady of Mrs. Heathcote Kilcoon's breeding. He opened his eyes and found himself looking into the face of a large foxhound, which slobbered and panted disgustingly. The Commandant looked wildly around. The dell was filled with dogs. A tide of tails waved above him, and out above them all, Mrs. Heathcote Kilcoon sat impaled upon him, beating around her with her riding crop. Colonel Heathcote Kilcoon and the other members of the hunt had emerged from the woods and were surveying the scene in amazement. "Good God, Daphne, what on earth do you think you're doing?" The Commandant heard the Colonel shout angrily. Mrs. Heathcote Kilcoon rose to the occasion magnificently. "I'm having a shit," she shouted, with a coarseness that Kommandant van Heerden found personally humiliating, but entirely apposite. "And if you were gentlemen, you'd turn your backs and get the hell out of here," she screamed. Her words were immediately effective. The huntsmen turned their horses and galloped back the way they had come. In the bushes on the edge of the dell, Else giggled softly. He'd never pretended to be a gentleman, and he'd always wanted to see the Colonel's wife in the nude. As they dressed in the dell, Kommandant van Heerden and Mrs. Heathcote Kilcoon were filled with post-coital depression. "It's been so nice to meet a real man for a change," she murmured. You've no idea how tiresome Henry can be. I'll send Boy over with the Land Rover to pick you up," she said. Before the Commandant could stop her, she had walked out of the wood and had mounted her horse and was riding away. End of Side 3.